Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this RSAA webinar, a continuation of a series so far of two about the impact of COVID-19 across Asia. Many of you, I know, were here last week for Kerry Brown and Ruby Wang's talk about China. Today, we have Sophie Ibbotson, a long-standing member of the Society and member of the Society's Council, and an expert on Central Asia, to talk about the varieties of responses to COVID-19 from the countries across Central Asia. And with that, I will hand over to Sophie to carry on. Sophie, welcome.
Thank you very much. And yes, welcome to my webinar for the RSAA. Today's webinar topic, as you may have gathered, is wildly ambitious, and it's quite possible that I've bitten off rather more than I can chew. In the next half hour or so, I'm going to be talking about 5 countries with a combined area of 1.5 million square miles, which is only slightly smaller than the entire European Union. Central Asia has a population of 72 million people and a nominal GDP of $300 billion. Michael, could you put the map up?
That should be there now.
Excellent. Although we frequently lump all 5 of the Central Asian republics together as the stans, there is huge regional variety in the geography, the culture, economic prospects and governance. The COVID-19 crisis has thrown up these differences into sharp relief. And although there are, of course, some shared issues across the region, which I will also touch upon in this talk, what I'm not going to do is talk you through a country at a time. You would probably die of boredom in about 5 minutes, and though the statistics are important, and I'll give you a few in the course of the session, it's what those numbers demonstrate which is most interesting. What I'm going to do is talk to you about 3 topics. The first is about the immediate responses to the COVID-19 crisis, including public health and economic interventions in each of the countries. Next, I'm going to talk about the short and the mid-term economic impact of the global shutdown and the slump in oil price. And then I'm going to talk about the countries, about what the countries' responses demonstrate about their regimes, their relationships, and the place that they hold in the world today. I'm going to compare and contrast the 5 countries throughout the webinar, drawing attention to what I think are the most relevant and interesting examples. Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan will get the bulk of my analysis. These are the countries which I know best and have worked in most recently. It's also a reflection of the difficulty of getting any credible information out of Turkmenistan, particularly at the present time. So first of all, the approaches. The Chinese authorities officially identified a new form of coronavirus in early January, recorded the first death on the 11th of January, and by the end of the month, the World Health Organization had declared a global public health emergency. I was working in Dushanbe in January, and already there were jitters. The British Embassy there was updating their crisis management plans. Assuming it's on your screen, I'd like you to take a quick look at the map. Many of you will have a good understanding of Central Asia's geography already, but if not, here's a little reminder. Tajikistan, like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, shares a border with China. Large numbers of Chinese workers and truck drivers enter Tajikistan every day. The Chinese have military outposts on Tajik soil. Half of Tajikistan's foreign debt, officially $1.2 billion, but probably rather more, is owed to Beijing. Sooner or later, whatever happens in China, good or bad, is going to have an impact in Tajikistan. This was the calm before the storm, however. Whether because of good luck, poor airline connectivity, lack of testing, or some other combination of factors, the first COVID cases were not recorded in Central Asia until the middle of March. Michael, is it possible to put up the second slide? Super, thank you. So on this slide, you can see the official figures from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, correct as of yesterday. The cases and deaths per million of population are still very low compared with Europe. For comparison, in the UK, we currently have 1,901 cases and 255 deaths per million of population. I'll talk shortly about why this might be. Tajikistan and Turkmenistan have still not officially reported any cases of COVID-19 in their countries. However, last week, the Financial Times declared President Berdimuhamedov of Turkmenistan to be a member of what it not so tactfully termed the Ostrich Alliance, those leaders denying the coronavirus threat. Tajikistan's President Rahmon may not have his head quite so deeply in the sand, as he is at least prepared to implement preventative measures, but a recent spate of mysterious deaths in Tajikistan, including that of the head of Department of Internal Affairs at Dushanbe's prosecutor's office, have been attributed to tuberculosis, pneumonia, and even swine flu. Skeptics fear otherwise. Testing is a major issue across all of Central Asia. Last month, a doctor in Burundi, and yes, I know Burundi is not in Central Asia, came into the spotlight when he said, there are 0 cases of COVID-19 in Burundi because there have been 0 tests. There's a certain amount of truth in that elsewhere too. In order to understand the scale of the problem, you need to be able to get hold of test kits. You need to have confidence in the accuracy of those kits. You need a distribution network in place to make sure that the population can get tested and that laboratories have got the devices to check the samples and get reliable results. At the moment, Uzbekistan, which is in a stronger position than most of the Central Asian countries, only has a capacity for about 9,000 tests per day, although that is increasing. As of mid-April, Tajikistan claims to have conducted 2,317 tests, all of which came back negative. My questions would be, who are they testing? Is the batch of tests they purchased defective or contaminated, as has been the case with some of the batches rejected in the UK? Are their laboratories processing them properly? If you don't have confidence in your tools, you can't have confidence in your data. What we can discuss with a little bit more certainty is the measures which have been implemented as immediate response to the crisis. As we're seeing across Europe, the strictness of social distancing measures and the point at which they begin is critical in determining the number of cases and, sadly, also the number of deaths. Now, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan both declared a state of emergency in the middle of March, with Kyrgyzstan following about a week later. Critics at the time said this was absolutely crazy and far too early. Uzbekistan hadn't even recorded its first COVID-19 death when the state of emergency was declared. But what the lockdown measures did do was reduce mobility and social contact, dramatically slowing the virus's spread within these countries. The borders are closed, some cities are quarantined, public gatherings are banned, and there are substantial fines and in some cases criminal charges which can be brought for breaking the rules. Now, Kazakhstan has begun to lift some of the restrictions this week, allowing some companies to reopen from the 20th of April, but they're monitoring the situation very closely and will reverse the easing if need be. The reason that stopping infection is so important in Central Asia is because not one of the states has got a sufficiently robust healthcare system to be able to handle a large number of cases. Even before the crisis, healthcare spending as a proportion of GDP was well below the OECD average. And the majority of the financial burden for healthcare is borne by individual households, not by the state. Tajikistan's Ministry of Health doesn't know how many ventilators there are in the country. And the Deputy Health Minister in Kyrgyzstan made a statement admitting that half of the ventilators that they have in Kyrgyzstan don't actually work. Uzbekistan wants to buy 150 additional ventilators to strengthen its existing ICU capacity, but has found that even by being a cash buyer, it doesn't really help right now. The manufacturers already have full order books right through into the end of the year, and Uzbekistan sadly is well down the waiting list for them. You'll be glad to hear that Turkmenistan is immune to such concerns, as well as apparently to COVID-19. President Berdimuhamedov has decided that burning uzalik, a local herb, is sufficient to ward off infectious diseases, and thus it has been used to fumigate schools and other public buildings. As healthy living is also a preventative measure, The president has been encouraging mass public bike rides. He has restarted the Football League, one of only 3 countries playing worldwide this season, and he is intending to celebrate Horse Day on the 26th of April. This will be with plenty of spectator events. Public health communications in Turkmenistan have been minimal, and several international news agencies have reported that even talking about coronavirus was banned, although this claim was subsequently proven false. It is, however, indicative of the situation and why it is worrying. I'm going to move on now to talking about the economic interventions and impact, including the short and long-term outlooks for the countries. This is arguably more important than the public health situation, as there is a very real risk that the economic crisis in Central Asia will kill more people than the disease itself. I personally fear it may already have done so. Lockdown measures have paralysed the global economy. The IMF, which isn't normally given to hyperbole, has already declared that this is the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Its magnitude and its speed are quite unlike anything we've experienced in our lifetimes. Worldwide, growth is estimated to be -3% this year, downgraded from the original prediction of 6.3% positive in January. And the longer the crisis continues, the worse it will get. There are a number of reasons that the economic crisis will hit Central Asia harder than other regions, and why, in my opinion, Uzbekistan will actually fare better than its neighbours, albeit still receiving a brutal blow. I'm going to talk about the negatives first, the challenges for the region as a whole. Economies in Central Asia rely on the extractive industries, hydrocarbons and minerals in particular. Turkmenistan is an extreme example, but 90% of the country's export revenue comes from oil and gas. You've all seen what has happened to the oil price in recent weeks, and Turkmenistan is doubly buggered by the situation because their long-term price agreements for gas contracts with China, which account for 80% of all exports, are also indexed to the oil price. Kazakhstan's state budget was premised on a Brent oil price of $50 to $55 a barrel, and has therefore had to be urgently revised with $1.5 billion of spending cuts. Demand for Uzbekistan's natural gas has fallen, though interestingly this loss may be offset in part by the rising price of gold, of which Uzbekistan is also a large exporter. Another major component of GDP, particularly in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but applicable across the region, is remittances from migrant labourers abroad, and particularly those working in Russia. According to World Bank figures, their contribution to GDP in these 2 republics alone is anywhere between 30 and 50%. With lockdown measures in Russia and an inevitable slowdown in the Russian economy, these labourers aren't working and they can't send money home. RFERL, which has a harrowing but highly recommended podcast on their website right now about the plight of Central Asia's migrants, even suggests that remittances are being reversed. Families in Central Asia are having to send money back to their relatives abroad so that they can eat. Now, putting aside the macroeconomic picture for a moment, it's in communities like this, migrants, workers abroad and their families at home, that the greatest suffering will be. You might already have seen photos of Tajik migrants stranded for days at airports in Moscow, unable to leave the country because their flights are cancelled, but with nowhere to go back to. Already on the fringes of society, with no income, nowhere to live, no prospect of getting home, and little or no protection under Russian law, people are getting desperate. RFERL has already reported cases of people rummaging in bins for something to eat, of 30 to 40 people sharing a flat, and migrants being detained indefinitely by the Russian authorities because there's nowhere else for them to go and there are no flights on which they can be deported. Social distancing there isn't an option. Any cases of COVID-19 will spread like wildfire through camped, unsanitary conditions, and without healthcare benefits, the chances of migrants being treated is minimal. There are also rumours that Central Asian migrants presenting at Russian hospitals with COVID symptoms have been euthanized by doctors. Whether or not these claims can be substantiated is highly questionable, but such fears will undoubtedly deter the sick from seeking help. Back to Central Asia though. The third problem, after over-reliance on the extractive industries and remittances, is that the financial systems, and indeed the real economies, are generally not sufficiently robust and do not have sufficient reserves to absorb such shocks. With the exception of Turkmenistan, central banks and ministries have been doing what they can to lessen the blow, stabilise their currencies, and support the private sector. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have both lowered their interest rates. Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan have sold off a proportion of their foreign currency reserves, and crisis funds have been established, primarily to support households and SMEs with food baskets, wage subsidies, and unemployment benefits. You might remember that when Labour left power in the UK in 2010, Liam Byrne, who was then Chief Secretary to the Treasury, wrote a note for his successor. It was very short, very to the point, and very controversial. It said, "I'm afraid there's no money." We have the same problem in Central Asia now, with varying degrees of severity. Take Kyrgyzstan as an example. GDP in the last 5 years has been between $6.6 and $8.1 billion, a third of which is from remittances. The national deficit is just shy of 10%, compared to 1.5% in the UK. The balance of payments deficit is 405 million, and the currency has fallen 20% against the dollar since March. The total workforce in the country is around 2.6 million people, of whom 1.8 million are now unemployed. Even with the best will in the world, the best economists, and the most creative solutions, there is no money. The IMF has confirmed Kyrgyzstan will receive $120 million in emergency funding, but that comes with strings attached. The government has to immediately cut all non-essential spending to protect public sector salaries, pensions, and existing social welfare payments. There's going to be no option for additional public assistance or for economic stimulus plans. Uzbekistan's situation is rather brighter, and that is in large part due to the economic and financial reforms which President Mirziyoyev has put into place since he came to power in 2016. Many of you will already know that Uzbekistan was The Economist's Country of the Year last year, an accolade given to the country which is most improved. Prior to the crisis, GDP growth in Uzbekistan was steady at around 5.6%, FDI was increasing significantly, and the OECD described Uzbekistan as one of the most diversified export baskets in Central Asia, noting that it trades with a wider range of countries than most of its regional peers. Uzbekistan's strength right now is in that diversification and the value of the products which it exports. It's estimated that Uzbekistan holds the world's 4th largest gold deposits, and it's the 7th largest exporter of gold. The international gold price right now is at a 5-year high, and that offsets much of the losses from natural gas exports. Agriculture is still a major economic component in Uzbekistan. Mining and manufacturing are fairly well developed, and though it is on a current COVID-linked hiatus, tourism has also been booming. These industries have all enriched the national balance sheet in recent years. They've reduced the national deficit to 4.2%, and they've made sure that there's more liquidity in the system. A lot of capacity building work has been done at a government level, but also in the private sector to modernise, to become more competitive. And as a result, Uzbekistan may be one of the very few countries to buck the international trend and avoid recession this year. The current government growth prediction is about 3.7%, and OECD's estimate is 1.8%, which though lower is still positive. If you want a summary to this part of my talk, it's this. Short and mid-term economic outlook for Uzbekistan is moderate. The economic outlook for the other Central Asian states is very poor, though Kazakhstan has got deeper reserves to draw upon as it weathers this storm. My final part of the talk is about the shifting power dynamics in Central Asia. It's probably this section which is most controversial and subjective, but one which interests me most. Since the republics became independent in 1991, there has been a de facto hierarchy of wealth and regional influence amongst Central Asia's states. Kazakhstan, with its fairly stable regime, highest per capita income, and best economic and diplomatic connections with Europe, seems to take the lead. President Nazarbayev was father of the nation, but also to some extent a father figure for the region as a whole. I remember being in Bishkek after the Kyrgyz revolution in 2010, 10 years ago this month, and and asking the people who I met what sort of leader they wanted for their country. And time and again, I was told, we want a strong leader like Nazarbayev. People saw the prestige which Kazakhstan had within the region. They saw the economic development. They saw people had more money in their pockets and they wanted that for themselves. Nazarbayev stood down from power quite suddenly in 2019, and that surprised many Central Asia watchers, including me. He remains highly influential in Kazakhstan, however, retaining his title of leader of the nation and also chairmanship of key bodies such as the Security Council. His successor as president, Tokayev, whilst respected, lacks the charisma, the power and the loyalty which Nazarbayev enjoyed. But here's the rub. We are seeing less and less of Nazarbayev, and he has been noticeably absent throughout the COVID-19 crisis. I don't blame him for that. He's nearly 80. He has underlying health conditions which would make him a high-risk case. But in his absence, the Security Council can't meet. It's a legal requirement that as chairman, he has to be there for the meetings. The Security Council hasn't met since February the 11th, when it was convened to discuss interethnic violence and also made murmurings about an early COVID response. Since then, nada, no meetings. And clearly the scale of the crisis has escalated and the implications for Kazakhstan in every sense have changed. Why the Security Council hasn't met again, nobody can say, but the absence of Nazarbayev is one possibility. One opposition figure suggested on Facebook that Nazarbayev has died. This is the same thing that was claimed about Berdi Muhammadov when he disappeared for a while last year. I think that's unlikely, and I would hope that modern Kazakhstan has moved beyond such a Soviet strategy for just pretending pretending the leader of the nation exists when he doesn't. I do believe Nazarbayev is still alive, and I think it's far more likely that Nazarbayev doesn't wish to appear at the present time, and thus be a response associated with the responses to the crisis when the country is going through a difficult time. In any case, constitutionally, Tokayev as president is the man in charge, so it should be at Nazarbayev's discretion whether or not he wants to make public appearances. This is a very different situation to what we've been seeing in Uzbekistan. President Mirziyoyev is undoing the diplomatic and economic isolation which characterized, to some not inconsiderable extent, the first 25 years of Uzbekistan's independence. Instead, he's building international relationships, demonstrating the country's desire to be seen as an active and responsible partner. Mirziyoyev and his government have worked diligently at this over the past 3.5 years. But the COVID-19 crisis has provided an opportunity to show how much Uzbekistan has changed and the kind of international role that it wants to play. Earlier this month, the Diplomat magazine ran a headline, "Uzbekistan leads Central Asian diplomacy in the age of COVID-19. It highlighted Uzbekistan's provision of medical aid to Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan has subsequently also sent aid to Kyrgyzstan and to Russia. Sorry, croaking. RFERL, which has historically been very critical of the Uzbek government, actually went one stage further than this. Writing there, journalist Bruce Pannier said, "If there is one person responsible for actively trying to coordinate efforts within Central Asia, it is Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev." Mirziyoyev has reached out by phone to coordinate with the presidents of Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, recognising that global pandemics have no respect for national borders, especially ones as porous as those in Central Asia. When the immediate health crisis subsides and restrictions are lifted, Uzbekistan will be in a much stronger economic position to recover than its neighbours. Having spent the first 3 to 4 years of his presidency doing the groundwork and demonstrating during the COVID-19 crisis his ability and willingness to strengthen diplomatic relationships and lead through difficult times, I also expect to see much more of President Mirziyoyev on the international stage.
Thank you very much, Sophie.
Very material.
Well, that's a very interesting projection you give there, and I think it will probably lead to some questions. For participants online, if you would like to pose questions to Sophie, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and you can post questions there. Sophie and I will see them and respond. But I'd just like to sort of kick off with one observation really of my own. You mentioned, Sophie, that at least in some parts of Central Asia, there is a degree of denial about the reality of this disease and what kinds of responses are appropriate to it. I was in very early part of my career in the Foreign Office in the early 1980s when AIDS was becoming a major issue, but was at that time thought to be a problem primarily for the homosexual community. And the Soviet Union's response to this was to say that there were no cases of AIDS in the Soviet Union, and this was for the obvious reason that homosexuality was a manifestation of bourgeois decadence, which did not exist in the Soviet Union, and therefore AIDS was not a problem. I wonder if, although the language is different, the mentality behind the suggestions of horse riding trips as a way of avoiding COVID-19 have something of the same underlying awareness that the regime is not equipped to deal with it.
I think there is a certain amount of that. If you don't admit to there being a problem, you can't be responsible for not having handled it appropriately because the problem doesn't exist. And in states where there is not necessarily a functioning political opposition, there is not necessarily a robust media to question, the message which comes from the top is the only message which a lot of people will see. And there is of course an argument that by not talking about it, you stop public panic. But I think there is also an unwillingness to accept that there are problems and issues which the state is not equipped to deal with, either financially or because it doesn't have the expertise. In Turkmenistan in particular, we are talking about a police state, which does still have many of the characteristics of its Soviet predecessor. President Berdimuhamedov and his predecessor were both almost consider themselves godlike figures within Turkmenistan. So the idea that anything could have snuck past them and possibly be beyond their powers to overcome is something which is just not, it can't be countenanced in a political sense. You mentioned also about the scapegoating and the sort of blaming particularly on one element of the community. This isn't something we've seen so much directly in Central Asia, but in Russia I've been sort of looking quite a lot at the migrant situation there. And one of the other reasons which the Central Asian migrants in Moscow and in Russia are having such a difficult time is underlying xenophobia, but also the belief, which has been pushed by some elements of the Russian media, is that this is an Asian disease. This is a problem which has come from China, and Central Asians are a sort of a conduit for this disease into Russia. And so they certainly have been singled out, and there has been violence against Central Asian migrants in Russia because they are seen to be the vector of this disease, bringing it to Russia. There's probably no real basis for that, but there is a public opinion problem of certain individuals getting blamed for it.
Thank you very much. Can I pick up on some questions from the audience now, from Stephen Leoy. What do you anticipate being the Uzbek role in the region beyond the COVID-19 crisis? And will they be able to maintain this sort of leadership? Or do you anticipate that role returning to Kazakhstan?
I think before the crisis began, we already saw Uzbekistan starting to demonstrate the international diplomatic role that it wanted to play. And the example I'm thinking of particularly is in terms with the recent peace negotiations which have been going on in Afghanistan. And Uzbekistan has been the mediator for a number of the security talks and has been seen to be encouraging those talks to happen and facilitating them. So I think COVID is not the first example. We have, over the last year, Uzbekistan has been playing the diplomatic role and being stronger. We're also starting to see Uzbekistan having much better economic integration with the European Union, taking much more interest in the international financial markets. Uzbekistan listed its first 2 euro bonds in London last year. It is likely that or at least some of the state-owned enterprises which are being privatised will go to IPO in London. So Uzbekistan is pushing out and building those relationships beyond its traditional sphere of influence. So no, I don't think that when the crisis ends, Uzbekistan will retreat. I think this is a step in a more ambitious plan to be a proactive regional player and to step out from Kazakhstan's shadow. Economically, I think in GDP terms, Uzbekistan's economy is still only about half the size of that of Kazakhstan, but it has more than twice the population. So I think there is room for both of those countries to play a strong regional role in the same way, for example, in the European Union, we might have France and Germany. There is different dynamics to the relationship and different strengths of each parties, but it is certainly possible to have two well-respected international players in Central Asia.
Thank you. There are a little cluster of questions here that go both to the regional economics, but also to the scapegoating point that you mentioned. I'll just read snippets of 3 of them. How is COVID-19 likely to affect Chinese and Central Asian initiatives and responses in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative? And how far does COVID-19 impact on Central Asians' view of China? There are plenty of xenophobic responses online. Do you think that Chinese medical assistance would be welcomed?
The relationship between the Central Asian states and China is already quite strained. There is a feeling that the economies are overexposed to China. In particular, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have a disproportionate amount of their debt owed to Beijing, and there is a feeling that it comes with strings attached, whether that is loss of territory, loss of sovereignty, loss of influence in the region. And I think there has been a sort of a bit of a cold shock in the past couple of weeks that approaches that have been made to Beijing for debt relief have fallen on closed ears. Whereas in the past, similar arrangements with Russia, perhaps there would have been more understanding. China's position at the moment is, you took the debt. It is secured against assets. If you want debt relief, you lose the assets. That will, if push comes to shove, be very unfavourably received by the people, understandably, and by the governments. Over the last couple of years, there have been a number of protests about Chinese ownership of strategic assets, about the number of Chinese workers in the region, particularly labour. And I think that is a potential flashpoint, particularly as there have been allegations that although the borders are closed, Chinese construction workers and other labour for big Chinese projects have still been able to cross the border because money has changed hands. And there is therefore a feeling that we're suffering, we're under lockdown, but these people are still being able to come in, they're not being quarantined, they're not being subject to the same restrictions. If an outbreak is traced to Chinese workers in Tajikistan, for example, whether they cross the border legally or illegally, I think that would be a very, very difficult position for the government to defend. The prospects for the Belt and Road more generally in Central Asia, things inevitably will slow down in terms of construction because China's economy is also going to slow. It's going to have less demand for the raw materials which it's trying to extract out of Central Asia, and less money to spend. What I would say is China is in it for the long game and is probably better able to weather the situation than many other states. And because they have secured their loans in Central Asia against physical assets, even if the countries default, they may well end up holding dams and physical infrastructure, which some might say was their original objective in the first place. You have somebody's hydroelectric station, for example, you have them by the short and curlies because you control their power supply and possibly the power supply of the countries downstream as well. So the Chinese may actually consolidate their position in Central Asia.
Thank you. Could I come in with a very concrete question from Clive Newell? What's the situation of air cargo and travel from and between the Central Asian republics, and how does this affect trade? And what about overland routes? So
officially, civil aviation generally is stopped. Most of the land borders are closed, but there are, sorry, word has disappeared completely. Exceptions, there we go, exceptions made for freight. But that is not in every border crossing, not for every category of freight, and often there are quarantine or other restrictions applied to those crossing. In some cases, nationals can cross, but foreign nationals can't, which then means it's very difficult to get the truck back across the border going the other direction. One thing that is also to bear in mind is that export restrictions on foodstuffs have been put in place as well to try and ensure food security at home. So Kazakhstan, for example, which is normally a big exporter of grain and flour, has restricted exports to make sure that they have enough foodstuffs for the domestic population. That obviously, food security at home is hugely important, but if your economy is premised on exporting foodstuffs, or a large component is, that's going to be another area where the economy gets hit. And countries like Tajikistan, which do rely very heavily on imports, are going to be in a much more difficult position the longer this goes on.
Thank you. Jamshid Sultanov has commented in the chat channel on this, that Uzbek Airways have converted their two Boeing 767 aircraft from passenger to cargo. So clearly some practical consequences are being drawn. Sophie, you mentioned food supply. Christine Purdy has asked if there is such a limited agricultural sector and no capacity for imports, what does the approaching summer look like? Is there greater hope for minimal crops, or is greater dryness more likely?
I don't know in detail. I fear that food security, particularly in places like the Pamirs in Tajikistan, was already an issue. The World Bank has got a resilience program there at the moment, which is focused on private sector development, and a big component of it is agribusiness, trying to improve the supply chains for food security. The fact that that was identified as a need before the current crisis took off makes me concerned, because this situation is only going to exacerbate it. Any cross-border trade between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, for example, will grind to a halt, and I think it's unlikely that the usual agricultural exports from Uzbekistan into Tajikistan and into Kyrgyzstan will be taking place. So I expect, obviously, people will be growing whatever they can domestically, but we're not talking necessarily, much of Tajikistan is not a fertile country. We are going to have food shortages, and I expect the World Food Programme is going to have to increase their delivery of food parcels in Tajikistan as well. There is also going to be variety within countries, because there are all across the region families who are already on the breadline, and who are very, very vulnerable. Families, for example, who are reliant on remittances from migrant labourers who are now no longer sending that money. Their income has been stopped overnight. If they haven't got money, even if there is food to buy in the markets, they're in a very difficult position. The crisis funds that have been set up by the different governments, some of that money is allocated for food supplies for the elderly, for vulnerable people, but there will still be an awful lot of people who go hungry.
Thank you. And just staying with Tajikistan for a moment, Alex Munt from Berlin has asked, how will you rate the involvement stroke stance of Russia on the situation in Central Asia? Are countries like Tajikistan looking for guidance to Moscow, or is there hesitation?
I don't think they're looking for guidance to Moscow, because currently Russia is in a far worse public health state than any of the Central Asian republics, in terms of the number of cases and the number of deaths. So I think they wouldn't be looking to learn those kind of lessons from Russia. They're just hoping that their own cases will stay low. What they were, there were discussions with Russia about what could be done to support migrant labour and whether any repatriation would be done. That has gone a little bit by the wayside. Uzbekistan, I would say, has been the most proactive. They did actually, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs organised repatriation flights to Europe to bring Uzbeks back, and to Russia as well. And interestingly, the flights which were sent to Europe to pick up Uzbeks were the same planes were used to take stranded Brits and other EU nationals back to Europe. So the Uzbeks arranged for the evacuation of foreign nationals in Uzbekistan back to their home countries, as well as bringing Uzbeks back from Europe. So I think that was quite an interesting case, again, in terms of how Uzbekistan is working with its international partners. Uzbekistan did repatriate some of its people from Russia, obviously not all of them, but more so than the other countries. And the migrancy issue is a really, really tricky one, because migrant labour, from an economic point of view, is only of value to the country when it is abroad and working and sending back money. These people have stopped working, stopped sending back money. And if they come home, one, they definitely won't be working. Two, they're adding to the unemployment figures and requiring potentially social welfare. 3, there is a risk if they're coming back from Moscow that they are bringing infection with them. So Tajikistan in particular has been very, very wary and resistive to repatriating its nationals in case they bring COVID with them, but also because then they will be viewed as an additional drain on the state, which is already overstretched.
Thank you. Just turning for a moment to education. I mean, of course, in Western countries and indeed across the world generally, schools have closed down. Could you say a few words about the position in relation to schools in Central Asia, and to what extent, if at all, the governments of the various Central Asian countries are able to address that through things like distance learning?
My understanding is that schools in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are all shut at the moment. I think the schools in Tajikistan and Turkmenistan are still open. The ability to provide distance learning is negligible. Reasons for this: one is that most people would not have a laptop or tablet at home. Lots of people have got mobile phones, but e-learning is generally not set up for delivery to mobile phones. It's set up for delivery to laptops. There is also a connectivity issue. We've got large areas which either don't have any Wi-Fi or 3G, 4G signal, or the signal is very sketchy, and also the cost of data, mobile data, is very, very expensive.
Thank you. Stephen Loy has commented in the chat channel that at least in Bishkek, some schools have moved to distance learning, but it's obviously a major challenge in this environment. I wondered if you could say, I don't know if your own research has covered this, Sophie, but whether you're able to say anything about the situation in Mongolia.
I can't, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, that's apologies to the participant that posed that question. We'll have to leave you to find out the answer to that for yourself, I'm afraid.
You've lost sound, I'm afraid, Michael. I can't hear what you're saying.
I beg your pardon. Yeah, I'm back and just scrolling through. We have a question here about potential future research in the region from Kate Shields. For those of us who had been planning to do research in the region, in her own case in Uzbekistan, do you have any thoughts on the potential for doing research in a post-COVID-19 Central Asia?
In terms of physical travel to Central Asia, there is going to be a delay because the region is poorly connected by flights at the best of times. And even once international airlines start flying again, Central Asia is not going to be top of their priority for routes. So as airlines go from having effectively mothballed their entire fleets to re-establishing a full schedule, it will be done in stages, and Central Asia, I fear, will be low on the priority list. We will get some flights back with Air Astana and Uzbekistan Airways because they're the state airlines. But what we probably won't have is the regular onward connectivity to Bishkek and to Dushanbe. I would have thought that we would have, and this may be grossly optimistic, I would have thought that there will be some ability to travel back to Central Asia in the second half of this year. But what we may find is, particularly coming from a high-risk country like the UK, where there have been a lot of cases, that we are able to fly but then are expected to quarantine. or have other restrictions in place for a 2-week period after arrival. That will cause big problems for tourism until it's phased out. If you're going for research, hopefully you will have longer and be able to quarantine for the first couple of weeks. But no official guidance have been given on this at the moment, and a lot of it will depend about how the health situation develops domestically, how effective restrictions internationally have been on controlling the spread, how quickly we get a vaccine, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. The tourism industry worldwide, of course, is in pretty much a state of collapse at the moment. So that is going to be a major challenge. I have a question here about development projects and environmental issues more generally. Kate Shields again says that there's recently been a substantial investment in the Aral Sea region and in mitigating the environmental issues connected with it. How do you see COVID impacting on wider development activity?
I think what COVID has demonstrated is that there is a very real need for active international collaboration on development issues, whether that is pandemic response or education or the environment. These are cross-border problems which cannot be addressed by individual nation states. The Aral Sea situation obviously is a cross-border issue anyway, because the Aral Sea crossed between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. But in the last couple of years, as Uzbekistan in particular has been trying to address that issue, it has worked much more closely with the UN and with NGOs who have experience in environmental remediation. So that demonstrates that the government is valuing international expertise and international partnerships, and I hope we will see more of that. There is a risk with COVID that certain states will cut themselves off completely and never want anything to do with the rest of the world ever again. But I think those which are more realistic, more responsible, will recognise the value of their international relationships, whether those are academic or diplomatic or economic.
Thank you very much. Here there has been a certain amount of attention given to the problems that COVID-19 confinement creates for those who are in domestic relationships that are violent or abusive. Sophie van Dijk has asked whether there is any acknowledgement of this issue among the governments in Central Asia, and if so, what might they be doing?
Again, it varies state to state. The UN has been actually quite active on its regional social media channels, drawing attention to the increased risk of domestic violence as a public education programme. In Uzbekistan, we've seen the launch, I think actually in the last couple of weeks, but certainly it has been advertised in the last couple of weeks, of helplines for women, both in terms of psychological help, but also help to get out of abusive homes and find support. So the fact that the government has recognised and accepted that it could be a problem and is putting in place some measures to help with that, I think is a big step forward in recognising there is a problem, is one step to solving it. It's never going to be enough. We know even in the UK, we don't have anywhere near the number of spaces in refuges for men or women leaving abusive relationships. If we can't do it here at a sufficient level, we can't expect other people to do it. But that's not to say that they shouldn't try. So Uzbekistan is doing something. I've seen there is a women's refuge in, I think it's in Hujand in northern Tajikistan, which again has been pushing its existence on social media, trying to get additional funding to stay open and continue providing support. The big issue, other than, you can address the political support, you can address the funding support, but there is also a very deep-seated social problem which needs to be addressed, which is a belief, unfortunately, by a lot of people that domestic violence is acceptable. And unfortunately, unless you can change that mindset and make people realise, no, it's not an acceptable way to behave, and that just because you are married doesn't mean that you should put up with that, take up of services, even when they are available, is going to be quite low.
That's wonderful, thank you. I'm going to have to draw the webinar to a close here, I'm afraid. We are almost out of time, but thank you very much to Sophie and to all of our participants. It's been a genuinely global audience online today. If you are interested in other talks at the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, we have a YouTube channel on which many of our past lectures, recordings of our past lectures are available. Please go and search for that. And we will be back here again next Wednesday when Bill Hayton is talking about, for once, a non-COVID-19 subject, the invention of China. So please look out for that one as well. Thank you very much indeed to all of you.